Now, at this hospital, the work is quoted almost repetitiously, and it should be, is George Vaillant's study on the natural history of alcoholism. George was here for many years and did most of the work while he was at the Cambridge Hospital. And what George's work shows, he particularly used the Grant study, and that was a study where I think it was a class of 1942 at Harvard, was interviewed, selected members of the class, selected at random, were interviewed extensively. But I mean extensively. They were interviewed in terms of their personality structure, they were tested psychologically, their families were interviewed, they were followed over a period of time so that they really felt they had a grasp of what sort of person this was. George later picked up another retrospective study in which he could study people of other social classes. The idea was that at that time, that Harvard, after all, was upper middle class, so he had to balance the study with the Gluck's material because they had collected a lot of, not quite as extensive, but still pretty thoroughly done work on people of different social classes, particularly people of low-skilled working class and regular middle class. So that what George's study showed was that people who, according to every criteria we can understand, were not seen as people who were addictive personality types. And yet some of those people got addicted. They became alcoholic and they got into very serious trouble. And what is so interesting in George's material is that people then studying them made comments as to what they were like before. And you could see the retrospective falsification, that they decided what they were like before based on what they saw at the time they interviewed them. And this really is very important work and really forces us to think always of what we do when we do retrospective attempts to say what it was like for people growing up. It's very hard to know doing it backward. So that it really made a lot of the work that had been done before with SET not so good and not look so good, and it threw a lot of questions into it. Now this controversy goes on right now. I mean, every time there's a new flurry of an attempt to think in terms of social policy about intoxicants, the whole issue is to find an at-risk population, to define it early, and this is what prevention, to educate, to shift people's attitudes early and what have you, as if that were going to prevent this from happening. Well, that's a fairly tricky proposition, and it certainly dies hard because it has very attractive aspects to it. But there we are. Now, as far as setting work goes, there were efforts made to study things that looked like they were really taking the social setting into account. For example, a lot of studies were done that showed that addicts were more likely to come from populations of broken homes, particularly the loss of one parent and particularly the loss of the mother. That if that happened early, and if it happened at any time during childhood and what have you, that such people were more likely to become addicts than other aspects of the population. But if you looked at those studies closely, what they really showed was that people who had those social conditions came from that kind of deprived, and that was the word that was used again and again, from deprived social conditions, either economically or as a result of the loss of a parent, and those two were often combined, that those social conditions resulted in a kind of personality structure which led to addiction. It wasn't really work on the social conditions. It was really work that led to a certain notion of set, of personality structure, which in turn led to addiction. Now, in the last years, since the drug revolution, since 1962, we really have had a lot of experiences which lead us all to think that social setting is a much more prime determinant. One has to give credit where credit is due. I remember years ago, B.F. Skinner, when talking about something, said you can't choose your heroes. It's interesting how that's going on, because the person who really first called attention to the influence of the setting, maybe not the first in history, but certainly made most of it, was Tim Leary, who many think was the father of the drug revolution with his tune in, turn on, and drop out. And his contention was, at that time, working with psychedelic drugs and LSD, that the social setting and the physical setting in which the drug use took place made an enormous difference on the effect of the drug. And at the time, this now sounds absolutely, well, of course, everybody knows that. And after 25 years of the drug revolution, most people do know it. But at the time, the stricter biologists, the stricter quantifiers, really did not accept this and really did believe that it was the drug and the quantity of the drug and so on that was the important factor. And every time a law was made, any kind of social policy was developed around this, it would be around quantity, strength, and things like that. And the idea of the influence of the setting was not really recognized. But in any case, we did begin to learn a lot, and we did, around psychedelics, we learned that lots of people began to flip out in the middle 60s who used psychedelic drugs. At one time, it was the largest category of admissions to mental hospitals in the country. At Mass Mental Health Center, at one time, it was up to 80% of their admissions were people who were having these drug experiences. So the kind of drug hysteria that really gripped the country at that point is understandable if you look at those figures. Then it took some time. By the late 60s, early 70s, these reactions to drug experiences were virtually zero. By 1970, 71, I don't remember exactly, the Mass Mental Health Center had not one single admission as a result of a so-called bad trip, as a result of a drug reaction. So in a period of about 5 or 6 years, it virtually disappeared. And what people were saying was that the drug use had stopped. In fact, it hadn't. Through 1973, psychedelic drug use continued to be the fastest growing drug use in the country. But the noxious experiences had, if not stopped, at least had become far less important. And then a couple of people from California, McLaughlin and Arnold, Bill McLaughlin, who was a very prominent drug researcher at the time, went back and studied the people who had taken psychedelic drugs in the 50s, before the drug revolution. And incidentally, they were given out a lot at that time. They were called psychotomimetics, and the residents at the Mass Mental Health Center at Chestnut Lodge routinely were asked to take psychedelic drugs on a buddy system, because the idea was that you would learn something about how psychotics think in a limited way. You'd only do it for a few hours. That would improve your capacity as a therapist. And a number of articles appeared in the literature which said, I took the psychedelic drug, I learned something about how psychosis worked, and indeed I became a better therapist as a result. I think I'll leave that till the end if we have time to talk about therapy as to whether there wasn't a certain amount of truth in that. But the important thing from McLaughlin and Arnold were that these people, some liked taking it, some hated it, and so on, but there weren't the kind of noxious reactions. So that the important development was that what had happened that caused people to really flip out in great numbers was really a social setting variable. That at that time people believed that you could get heaven or hell out of these drugs. You could achieve mystical oneness with the universe, you could have a religious experience. It was really touted, or on the other hand, you could go crazy. And with that kind of belief and with that kind of attention that was being paid to the use, it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. The social setting brought about some of the very thing that people were afraid of. So that focused attention on the influence of the setting. And the next big, I almost think of them as social experiments to focus the attention on the social setting, was the Vietnam War, where we sent hundreds of thousands of young people into a social setting which was, for them, horrible, which was terrifying, where they were hated, they hated the people they were with, they were fearful every second. I was there, it seems like a terribly long time ago now, but I'll never forget what it felt like to be in a huge installation, Long Been, where there were thousands and thousands, 100,000 people or something like that, and there would be an incident, not often, every 2 or 3 days. A little plastique explosive would go off, one person was killed, 2 lost legs, sometimes only 2 lost arms. It wasn't much, but what it meant was, in terms of the extent of casualties, is you never put your foot down anywhere without being scared. You never took a single step where you weren't frightened. And that's a very unusual experience, and it really creates a level of tension that's hard to characterize and to live in our current life, where you know, we don't like to cross Cambridge Street because the way some people drive, but that's a relatively limited experience of anxiety.